Hello, and thank you for participating in this webinar. I'll be talking about airborne transmission of the COVID virus and doing something about ventilating. I want to start by talking about my grandson. I'm an OPA, grandfather, and therefore I got bragging rights. So here's a picture of me trying to teach my grandson how to skate. This was a couple of years ago. But recently, at the end of September, he started JK, and one day he ended up sick because he had a runny nose. So his mom had to come and pick him, and it was about a half-hour drive in the car with him and his sister, a younger sister. And when mom got home, she found that she couldn't handle it, so we offered to help out. So we came over and picked him up. And the next day, mom was sick too, and dad had a scratchy throat, so he stayed home from work. So we picked him up again and brought him home, and he came along with some of his schoolwork. And in his schoolwork was this nice picture of coughing into your sleeve. And while he's showing it to me, he coughs into my face. And so I remind him about the etiquette, and he says, "Oh, that's just for school." I was just amazed that in 3 weeks of school, he could already have that attitude of splitting education from reality. Anyway, I got sick that evening, and then a few days later, my partner got sick, and my son got sick, and a few days later, his girlfriend got sick. My grandson's sister also got a mild case, and the grandson and his dad both got tested for COVID, and it was negative. But whatever it was, the symptoms came on really fast within a day or two, and everyone seemed to get it. Half of his class was off sick, and it eventually went through the other classes in the school, and half the teachers in the school were off. Now, this is not COVID. This is different than COVID. In COVID, most cases don't spread to more than 1 or 2 people. However, there's a minority of cases that spread it to a lot of people, sometimes called super spreader events. The super spreader event is not just a person, but it's the interaction of a person, an environment, and over a time trend of the disease. It's called the power law or the Pareto distribution, where 10 to 20% of the cases will cause 80 to 90% of the infections. And these are often caused in crowded places, close contact settings, and confined and enclosed spaces. And these are the 3 C's that the WHO is trying to get everybody to be aware of in order to avoid further transmission. So this is a transmission chain, which shows a number of dots. Any single dot is just one person who got sick and didn't pass it along. You'll see a lot of dots there have 1 or 2 connected dots, and these are minor transmissions. But every once in a while you see these stars where 1 dot is connected to a whole bunch of dots. And that's what we mean by just a few people are transmitting most of the disease. And the reason this is the case is because SARS transmits before people know they have the infection. And it's this period of time between about a day or 2 before the symptoms begin to show up that people are fairly highly infectious. It's also interesting to note that after day 10, you're still shedding virus or virus parts that can be picked up by the swab test, the PCR test, but you're no longer infectious. So it complicates things when you're just looking at tests alone. This is an example of an outbreak that happened in Hamilton, where our clinic is, and it ended up with 74 cases linked to a place where people would pedal stationary bicycles, and it went to households, schools and daycare, healthcare facilities, and other workplaces. This is another outbreak that happened in Beijing, and here you'll see a chart which shows the index case at the top left-hand corner, and then co-workers, the ones in blue, ended up getting infected. And then customers also got infected. They're the green dots. And then those customers gave it to other people after the store was closed, the gray areas after the store was closed. And you can see that there were many cases related to the one. And this is a diagram from the article that describes this, and it shows that droplet and aerosol transmission were indicated. It should be noted that aerosol transmission can also occur within the droplet transmission range when you're just 1.5 meters away from the person. Both aerosol and droplet happen there. Aerosol only happens beyond about 1.5 meters or 2 meters. Then there's the famous restaurant in Gwangju. If you look at the picture there, you see the African pot restaurant on the second floor. It's kind of a hole-in-the-wall type place, very crowded, and there was an outbreak there. And there was an investigation that was published, and they concluded that it was droplet transmission being blown around by an air conditioning fan. However, they noted our study has limitations, and we did not conduct an experimental study simulating the airborne transmission. So what happened next was another group did exactly that. They did the simulation, and they took measurements in the restaurant, and they came to a different conclusion, that short-range aerosol spread, which includes large droplets and small droplets, was the cause. And it emphasized that it's crucial to prevent overcrowding and provide good ventilation in buildings if you want to avoid this type of transmission. Here's a picture of their simulation, and you can see with the blue cloud where the infected person and the other infectees were sitting. There was also a story of a bus where one person was the initial infected person, and a number of other people on the bus were infected, and they were located more than 2 meters away from the initial person. And so it kind of challenged the rule that you could only have 2 meters, you could only be infected within 2 meters. And so they noted, though, they had video cameras on the bus, and that anyone who wore a mask was not infected. However, this paper was retracted, and there was no reason given, and it seemed like it was being suppressed by the Chinese government. There was another report of a similar outbreak on a bus, and this shows you again in the middle there the person who was the initial patient, and then all the other people who were infected. Then there was the famous choir in Skagit Valley, where 61 people attended a practice for the choir, and 53 of them became infected. There was also a few days earlier another choir in Amsterdam that performed, and they had 130 members attend, and 102 of them were ill. 1 died, and 3 of their partners also, as secondary infections, died. However, few, if any, of the concert attenders were infected, which again goes to show that you need to be a certain distance from a person with the infection. There's also a recent publication from South Korea where in August a number of people in an apartment building became infected, and they had no contact with each other. And what it was found was that the air vents to the washrooms were spreading the virus when the temperature was in an inversion. So instead of the air going up the vent, because of the temperature differential, it went down the vents and spread the virus from one bathroom to the next bathroom. A similar thing happened in Hong Kong in March, and here's a newspaper story that came up with a theory of how it happened. And this was once it got outside, it circulated because of airflows and ended up coming into the kitchens of other apartments. And this all sounds familiar because in SARS-1 back in 2003 in Hong Kong, there was an outbreak in a number of high-rise apartment buildings, and people did modeling of the airflows due to the wind direction, and they found that under certain wind directions, the air would go down and go into other apartments, and explained how people who had no contact with each other ended up infecting each other. And since we're talking about bathrooms, here's a study of the particles that are emitted from a toilet seat when you flush the toilet. And they put a certain ray of light, and you can see the particles. And beside it there shows where most of the particles land on the floor or walls, depending on what the stall looks like. However, we had a hard time getting people to accept that it's airborne. In fact, this is a tweet that was sent out by the WHO in March 28, 2020, that basically said that messages on social media saying that COVID was airborne were fake news, and it was incorrect. And they said COVID-19 is not airborne. However, in October of this year, they changed their tune, and they did say that under certain conditions, where there are enclosed spaces, prolonged exposure to respiratory particles, and inadequate ventilation, actually the 3 C's stated in other words, you can get airborne transmission, and that to prevent airborne transmission, you need ventilation. All this confusion and misinformation about the transmission routes reminds me of the old Indian folk story about the 6 blind people and the elephant. They all touch a part of it, and they're blindfolded, or they can't see the whole picture, and they have all different theories about what's going on. Every one of them is a little bit right, but taken together, they're all wrong. The Public Health Agency of Canada came out in October with this statement, and it basically said that after denying that it was airborne, that the infection can spread through respiratory droplets and aerosols. They also mentioned that these aerosols can linger in the air under some circumstances. Again, the 3 C's, crowded spaces, and that poor ventilation will aggravate this. And here you have the 3 C's mentioned. And one of the solutions is, again, ventilation, drawing as much fresh air from outside as possible. I think this is one of the best pictures I've seen that explain what's happening when you're talking, coughing, sneezing, that type of thing. The green particles are the droplets. They're the large particles that come out of your mouth, nose, and you can see that they fly like projectiles. They go up and then they fall down to the floor. Now the red stuff is a cloud that comes with it. These are the small particles, and they come out in a puff, a kind of a jet stream that slows down and eventually gets picked up by the air currents, and they stay airborne. And these two happen together. It's not like the red doesn't exist and it's only the green particles. They come out together. Here's another picture of it, and it shows the relative humidity, and you can see that when it comes out of your mouth, it's 100% humid, relative humidity, and it goes slowly, it evaporates and becomes similar to the relative humidity in the room. The bottom picture actually shows the different size droplets. The the red ones being the largest, which are ballistic, and the green ones being the in-between size, which also fall to the floor. But the blue ones are the very small particles, and it looks like spaghetti coming out of the mouth, but these are the pathways that the small particles take. Here's a picture that shows what happens, and you can see that the blue color means it happens very quickly. Using the scale from 0 to 2 seconds, the blue particles that are bigger than 320 micrometers fall to the floor. When you look at 80 micrometers, it takes a little longer, but eventually they do also fall to the floor. Now, when you get to the smaller particles, the 20 micron particles, you actually see that they kind of move up, and it's the thermal heat from the body that actually allows them to go up instead of down. And you can see these small particles eventually ending up on the ceiling. And when you put them all together, this is what it looks like. It's a good thing we can't see this in real life. And once the smoke clears, this is how you see the residual. You see particles on the person, on the floor, and even some of the small particles sticking to the ceiling. And so this diagram here shows how the large particles come out, and you see the graph on the top in black showing the ejection of particles from the person. You see the larger particles kind of settling to the floor within 1 meter. And the blue graph at the top shows that there's less than the black graph of particles at 1 meter. And at 2 meters, it shows much less. And you can see that it's only the very small particles that can go that far. Most of the large particles will fall to the floor before it reaches 1 meter. And these are the various pathways that people have come up with of how the infection can transfer from an infected person to a person at risk of infection. And the writing is very small, so I've expanded it. So we start with an infected person, and they have some type of respiratory activity, which means breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing. And you end up with large droplets and secretions, and these secretions can end up in someone else's eyes, nose, or mouth. They can also end up on the hands of a person who is susceptible, and they can touch their own eye, nose, and mouth. They can also end up on surface contamination via the hands of a person who is infected or just dropping. And one person can also touch another person and pass on. And once a person has virus, even though they're not infected, they can pass that contamination onto a surface, which again can go onto another person. Then we have the smaller particles, aerosols or small droplets, and some of these can be inspired, which means it ends up in the top part of your respiratory system, not in the bottom. The very small particles can go all the way down to the bottom of the lungs. And all three of these routes can cause an infection in a person at risk. Not to mention that some of the aerosols and droplets can also stick to the ceiling or to other surfaces and cause surface contamination. We also have the issue of fecal and urinary transmission. Remember the bathrooms in Hong Kong and Korea? So how do we stop this? Well, we put a mask on the person who's infected, and hopefully that blocks these paths. We ask people who are dealing with people who are sick to wear masks, wash their hands, and goggles and gowns. We also suggest face masks on people who are susceptible, and hand washing to stop the contamination from surfaces to the hands, to the eyes, nose, or mouth. And face shields again for people who are infected but don't know it. Then we also have masks to stop the small aerosols and droplets. And these are the masks that are put on the person who is infected. However, a person who is receiving this needs an N95 to stop the small droplets and aerosols because they are not effectively stopped by the surgical masks. And of course, we also need to do surface cleaning wherever it's could be contaminated. And this is just part of the cleaning. It's more than just hand washing and masking. It's also communicating, cleaning, as mentioned, ventilating, distancing, and screening. This comes from our website, which is called Regional Risk Tool and Tips. And our advice is based on these 7 categories: communicating, cleaning, hand washing, ventilating, distancing, screening, and masking. And we're going to focus on ventilating. Here is the list of the issues to deal with from the website, and I won't go into them right now because we'll be talking about them in the rest of the presentation. So how do you go about doing all this? Well, first of all, you got to understand what the ventilation system is. You have air coming in from 2 sources, one being recirculated and one from the outside, and that gets mixed and it either gets heated or cooled. And then it goes through pipes and goes into rooms, and there's a return, the purple arrows, that goes back. Some of it gets exhausted, but some of it gets recycled. If you're in an office or a classroom, this is what the supply usually looks like and what the returns usually look like. The air comes out of the supply and goes back to the ventilation system through the return. So it's a good idea to actually go on the roof and look at these systems. If you're part of a health and safety committee, you should put this on your tour. Make sure you look inside too. Stop the power to it, open it up, and have a look. You'll never know what you'll find. Here you see a lot of water damage, dirt. You see a filter that's bent out of shape, so it's not sitting there. Plus the filters are fairly dirty. So put on your to-do list. Go look inside your HVAC unit. Measuring airflow. This is the way it's properly done. Those vents in the ceiling, you can put these little pup tent machines over top of it and it measures the airflow. You can also use this machine, but it's a little more complicated. The problems with air changes per hour is that while most HVAC systems are designed to turn over the air 6 times per hour, this only happens if you leave the fan setting on, not on auto. On auto, it only comes on when you need heating or cooling, which is not all the time, and therefore it's off. And when it's off, there's no air coming in. Usually most HVAC systems only have about 10 to 25% of the air being recirculated by the HVAC unit is actually outdoor air. And thus, if you have 5 or 6 air turnovers per hour, but only 10 to 25% of that air is fresh air, then actually the outdoor exchange rate is actually 0.5 to 1.5 air changes per hour. And this all assumes you have perfect mixing, which means that the air circulates over the whole volume of the room and there are no dead air spaces, which there usually are. Open windows and doors will give you more air changes. If you go to 100% outdoor supply, you won't be able to manage the temperature and humidity in extreme weather conditions. So as we get very cold here in our winter, it's hard to take in 100% outdoor air. So another thing to put on your to-do list is to make sure the fan setting is on. Now particles take time to settle and clear a room. You can see that the large particles, 100 microns, only take about 3 seconds to fall a meter, whereas a particle that's 5 microns falls about 20 or takes about 20 minutes to fall a meter. However, this is in still air, and when you have air currents, these things get swept up. And if you have the very small ones, it takes hours and days for these particles to settle. So how many air changes do you need to clean a room? So normally ventilation systems are designed to 6 air changes per hour. And to remove 99% of a contaminant from a room at 6 air changes per hour, it would take about 46 minutes. To get 99.9, it would take an hour and 9 minutes. So sometimes carbon dioxide is used as a surrogate for measuring outdoor air supply, and we know that the outdoor level of carbon dioxide is about 400 to 500 parts per million. And if you're below 600, it's usually not a problem. If you're between 600 and 800, it's a possible problem. 800 to 1,000, it's a probable problem. And if you're over 1,000, you need more outdoor air. And here's the color scheme we'll be using for these levels. This also relates to the ASHRAE standard, which basically recommends 900 parts per million for an office type environment. There are problems with measuring CO2. There's relatively cheap sensors available, but they may not be as accurate. A really good one will set you back probably over $2,000. Also, because you exhale about 30,000 parts per million when you exhale of carbon dioxide, don't breathe on the sensor. Make sure there are no other sources of carbon dioxide like combustion exhaust, dry ice, or outdoor air entrainment from traffic. Outdoor air is usually less than around 400 parts per million. But with a lot of traffic nearby, it could be as high as 700 parts per million. Also, you want to take a grab sample. You don't want to take a time-weighted average like we do with other measurements, and it's actually better to track it over time. A surrogate for outdoor air supply, if it doesn't work, you can measure it directly with those pup tent machines I was showing you earlier. Most indoor standards suggest not to exceed 1,000 to 1,200, but keeping it below 800 parts per million is probably better under these pandemic conditions. At 100% outdoor air, the level should be less than 600 parts per million. Lower occupancy will mean lower carbon dioxide levels, but not necessarily more outdoor air supply, so you really need to be careful how you interpret these measurements. Here's a pattern which is fairly typical. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the carbon dioxide level is about 550 parts per million, and as people enter the building, it climbs, and it reaches just before 12 o'clock, almost 900, and then has a little dip during lunchtime, goes back up, and in the middle of the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, it's at about 950 parts per million. And then you have people gradually leaving the office, and you see a curve going down from about 850 down to about 550 parts per million. And this is the typical view. Now this slope of this decay curve, we call it, from about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening till about 5 o'clock in the morning, you can calculate the air changes per hour from that curve. And here's we superimpose the categories that we talked about earlier in the colors. Here we have a time pattern where we had the carbon dioxide climb steadily, and then all of a sudden it just kept going right up to the time that somebody opened the door, and then it dropped dramatically, and then it went on down a bit as people leave the building, and then it dropped again as the door was open again, and then you have the curve. And what we found out with this building was that somebody had blocked off the outdoor air intake, and so it just kept going, carbon dioxide just kept going up and up. This is one of the worst cases I've ever measured, and this was in a portable in a school. And here during the morning, 9 o'clock, we're already starting at 900 parts per million. We go up to 3,600 in the morning, and then at lunchtime it drops down as the doors and windows are open to some degree. And then in the afternoon, it almost reaches 5,000 parts per million. And what happened here was two classrooms got together to watch a movie, and they closed the curtains and the windows and everything. And so you have two classrooms in a building that's only supposed to have one class. And you can see it decay overnight after people leave, but in the morning, you're still in the pink. And so you're breathing yesterday's air when you come into the classroom the next day. Carbon dioxide measurements, the background levels are taken in the middle of the Pacific. You can see that little red star there in the Hawaiian Islands, and they've been measuring it there on top of a mountain for many years. And when I started measuring carbon dioxide in my career in the late 70s, the level was about 330 parts per million. Last week, it was about 415 parts per million. So you can see in the time of my career how much the levels have changed, almost 100 parts per million. Carbon dioxide at first was thought to have no health effects, but recent research has shown that there are possibilities that cognitive function is affected by carbon dioxide concentrations that are higher than average. There's also the issue of thermal comfort. When you're trying to get as much outdoor air quality or outdoor air supply as possible, the problem is that people will not be thermally satisfied because at very cold and very warm temperatures, the system will not be able to control the temperature. Now in the spring and the fall, when the outdoor temperature is about 10 degrees or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can take as much outdoor air as you want because that's the temperature at which the HVAC tries to temper the air. However, under the extremes, you won't be able to keep that temperature. So you need to tell people that they need to start wearing sweaters, take blankets, thin gloves, space heaters, whatever they need, because the more outdoor air you supply, the harder it is to control the temperature. Open windows, the use of barriers could disrupt airflows. If you want to follow the pattern of the air, I would suggest buying one of those soap bubble guns and watch the bubbles and see which way the air flows. Relative humidity will also be very difficult to maintain in the Canadian winter. If you are looking at humidifying the air, it's recommended to use steam injection humidification systems. So another thing on the to-do list is to prepare the building occupants for thermal discomfort. So here we see ranges of relative humidity and the ranges at which various problems in buildings occur. And you can see the optimum range is probably between 30 and 60% relative humidity for most of these. However, for viruses, you want it even a little higher, about 45 to 70% relative humidity. And as I said already, that's hard to do in Canadian winter. Here's a pattern of measurement of carbon dioxide, which is the blue bar, and then you see in gray the relative humidity, and it's pretty obvious that the relative humidity is following the carbon dioxide exactly. And this happens when the source of moisture in the air is exhaled breath, and the carbon dioxide is a measure of exhaled breath, and when it patterns this way with the relative humidity, it means that your moisture is coming from people's breathing. And that's not how you want to humidify a workplace. Here again, I've put the colors on top, and you can see that the carbon dioxide is pretty good. but the relative humidity is well below the 45 to 70%. So another thing on your to-do list is to check into humidification. Here are some standards being recommended for the pandemic on how to adjust your ventilation system. And these come from the US, ASHRAE, from the European Union, RIVA, and also from Japan and China. Now this is a little bit hard to read, but we have a ventilation checklist that's available on the OCAL website that you can download that will take you through some of these items. So another thing for your to-do list is to download this checklist and review it. Now here I've reworked the table you saw on the previous slide, and I've expanded the font so you can read it better. But it's interesting to note, first of all, outdoor air, everybody agrees, take in as much as possible. Hours of operation, there's a bit of difference. Some people say run it 24/7. Others say, well, at least 2 hours before occupancy and 2 hours after. Temperature, humidity settings, it depends. Again, demand-controlled ventilation. What this is when you measure carbon dioxide, and then after it reaches a certain level, you kick in extra outdoor air. So when they say use the CO2 set point of 400 parts per million, this is background level, so it will always be on. And in Japan, they also say set the CO2 level lower, but in ASHRAE, they say disable it. Filters, this is really interesting because the ASHRAE, the US, recommends increasing filtering. However, for the other society, they say filter as usual, or replace them more often, or maintain them as usual. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. But so far we have no cases from contact tracing of people being infected by people in another room via the ventilation system. So it's unclear whether this extra filtering is really necessary. Whether the new variant and its increased transmissibility will change that, we don't know yet. ASHRAE doesn't really talk about ventilating washrooms, but it's implied if you're running it 24/7. But the other societies make a point of telling you to run the ventilation for the washrooms 24/7. And a couple of them also make a point of closing the lid when you're flushing. Remember that diagram I showed with all the particles being expelled from the open toilet? Also to avoid water seals drying out. And that goes back to some of the problems that we saw with the apartment buildings in China and South Korea. So here's another thing to do on the to-do list, is to take this table and compare it with the checklist and give it to the Joint Health and Safety Committee and see what they can do. Sometimes you can't do filters, so you have to look at other things. So you need to mix and match to see what you can do to optimize your situation in your building. Regarding filters, Jeffrey Siegel of the U of T, who's an indoor air quality expert, looked at these, and he basically says in most situations, filters may be considerably less effective than other infection control measures, including social distancing, isolation of known cases, and hand washing. So don't put your eggs in all one basket. If your system can't handle these higher efficiency filters, don't worry about it. There's other things you can do. There is also another issue which suggests that the virus hitches a ride with the particles that are already in the air, and thus it can penetrate the lungs with a greater efficiency. So removing the particulate with better filtering might also have a benefit if the virus is hitchhiking on those particles. Now, a while ago, the government said they were going to give $50 million to upgrade school HVAC systems, and if you do the calculations, it ends up about $10,000 per school. So what do you do with $10,000 per school with an HVAC? So that amount of money is just about enough to buy a bunch of air purifiers. So that's what people are doing. One thing to look at when you're looking to buy an air purifier is the clean air delivery rate, or CADR. And you roughly need, for every 100 square foot, 70 CFM. So for the first one in the blue, you see 312 CFM, which is roughly about 450 square feet. 400 CFM is about 600 square feet, and 560 CFM will cover about 800 square feet. So you need to size them properly. Another thing to take account of is the maximum noise level. In most offices and classrooms, it's recommended that the background noise level not exceed 30 to 40 decibels. And here we see that the levels of noise are 50, 56, and 70 decibels, which is much higher. Here's an example of a paper that evaluated a number of air cleaners in the classroom. First of all, note that the carbon dioxide levels were over 1,000 parts per million. And sometimes air cleaners are being used to justify having less outdoor air, which is expensive to heat or cool, and that they are used instead of bringing in outdoor air. So here are the 4 locations. There are 4 air purifiers in this situation. And also, if you look at the decibel ratings, they're much higher than the recommended background. So you can probably only run these at setting 2, so you probably won't get as much as you want. Again, this study was funded by a supplier who sells these air cleaners. Here's an air cleaner that is advertised as being able to cover 275 square feet. Notice that the office is 301 square feet, so it's already undersized. But the position is also important, where you put the air cleaner. For instance, we have 4 positions in this office, and position 4 is actually underneath a desk. And so what these people did is they calculated the airflow and compared it to the actual, which is supposed to be 178 CFM. And they found that, for instance, in position 4, you got 116 CFM underneath the desk, which is roughly equivalent to 175 square feet. In position number 1, 100 CFM, which is about 150 square feet, which is only half the size of the floor space of the office. At position number 2, 174, similar to being under the desk, which is kind of odd. And then finally, in position 3, which was the best, almost 150 CFM, which is still less than 178. And 223 square feet instead of 301. Now, if you took these filters and aged them, it turns out they have even less, only 36 CFM, which is equivalent to 45 square feet, which means that you need another 3 in addition to the 4 before you can adequately do the whole room. So where are you going to put those 7 air cleaners in a small office like this? Here again is the measurements that they took that show that an aged filter only does 20% of its original flow. So here's something if put on your to-do list again. If you're going to get some of these air purifying units, you need to make sure you do your homework, size and locate them properly, and very important to take good care of them. Jeffrey Siegel again on UV systems, which are another thing that was being touted as a solution. Again, these are complex systems, and unless you know what you're doing, you should probably not get involved in them. Plus, there are some dangers. Some of the other technologies too, like ionizers, ozone generators, etc., all have some serious toxic issues which need to be addressed and are probably not a solution if you're not tech savvy about these things. So as a kind of a summary from the European CDC on ventilating and air conditioning systems, first of all, they came to these conclusions. Transmission of COVID commonly occurs in closed indoor spaces. HVAC systems have a complementary role in reducing transmission by increasing the rate of air exchange and decreasing the recirculation of air, and using filters. The risk of infection caused by air distributed through ducts is very low. Some people are saying that because the air is blown around, it's blown from the person who is sick to the person who is not sick, and therefore the ventilation system is aggravating the infection. However, this is extremely rare, and only the restaurant in Gwangju, that situation, it probably happened, but normally it is not expected to happen. The airflow generated by air conditioning units may facilitate the spread of large droplets by infected people, especially if the air is blowing hard over one area towards another area. However, well-maintained systems are usually not responsible for distributing aerosols. There is limited evidence regarding the effect of standalone air filtration and other cleaners. So they suggest that the removal of and control of COVID sources is the #1 thing to do. Keep people who have COVID or are associated with exposure to COVID from going into the indoor space. Engineering controls like HVAC units can work if they're done properly, and you can also look at opening windows and doors. Then there's administrative controls by reducing the number of people in the indoor space, and then obviously the protection that individuals can do by keeping their distance, practicing good respiratory etiquette, and wearing a face mask. And this is all part of the hierarchy of controls, where you try to stop it at the source, prevent people who are sick from coming into the building, along the path using the ventilation system, and at the worker using the personal protective behaviors. And it all comes down to communicating, cleaning, hand washing, ventilating, distancing, screening, and masking. And there are lots of resources online, like this poster for schools that discuss these things, and it'd be a good idea to add to your to-do list to use some of these creative communication tools and apply them to your workplace. So here is your to-do list, and I won't go over these, but remember that working on the ventilation system isn't the only thing you do. It's also communicating, cleaning, hand washing, distancing, screening, and masking. They're all parts of the puzzle, and just by getting too focused on one of the things, you might ignore something else, which may actually be more effective than, let's say, arguing about how good the filters should be. What about the new variants? Well, first of all, they cause increased transmissibility. These will make all these controls all the more important. In the EU, for instance, in Bavaria, people are being asked to wear N95s on public transport and in shops. Here's a news item, and it was being enforced as of January 18th. So thanks for your time and attention. And in the words of famous Canadian musician Bruce Cockburn, open up the window and let the bad air out.